Hello Year 7, today's lesson is on what was Britain and its empire like in the 18th and 19th century. So we can break down this key question into two main parts. We're looking at the 17 and 1800s, but the question's asking you what it was Britain like at that time and what its empire was like at that time. So the first thing you're going to do is look at what Britain as a country was like during this time. You'll look at the lives of people at this time, what their towns and cities were like, what jobs did they have, what were the inventions like at the time. You're then going to look at what the empire was like in this period. So an empire is a group of countries or states that's ruled over by one person or place. So for this example, we've got the British Empire. The British Empire was controlled by the government and the monarch, and they made decisions for the rest of the empire. Now, there were lots of countries that were in Britain's empire and that were ruled over by Britain. India became known as the jewel of the British Empire because of its rich resources Britain could take from it. So we're going to look at what life was like in those places at this time. How did Britain benefit those countries? Did they benefit those countries at all? Did they maybe make life really difficult for those places? Why did Britain want to rule over them? Were they trying to help them, or were they trying to exploit them? They're the sort of questions we're going to be asking and looking at over the next lesson. So, to start with, we're just going to have a look at the overview. It says, after the Renaissance had swept through Britain, lots of things had changed. But during the 18th and 19th century, there was a revolution happening in Britain, and it was about to change the future of the country. So, if we just go back over what Renaissance means again, just to remind ourselves. Remember, that was a time when the world was almost reborn, not physically, but the way we looked at the world, and things started to change. We started to question the way things were presented to us, okay? Scientists and inventors started to question the church and really start to push the boundaries. They drew art in a really realistic format, okay? Now that changed Britain a lot, but the 18th and 19th century took those changes even further, and it shapes the Britain we know today. So, what were those changes? It carries on to say, this was the Industrial Revolution. Starting in the 1400s, steam began to power production. So, what was the Industrial Revolution? Okay, industrial just means mechanisation. Okay, so it's to do with the mechanisation of machines. How do things work? How have we changed from machines being our hands to big factories? Okay. A revolution can either be violent or not violent, and this is basically just a big change that's happened. So the Industrial Revolution is a big change in the machines we use. All right. So it starts in the 1400s, and steam, which is a product of coal, basically powers all these factories that we know of. Okay. No longer were items being made by hand, which was very time consuming, but by machines. This change in production led to lots of changes throughout Britain. People started to leave their homes in the countryside where they were farming and work in the cities. The inventions of these machines meant more factories were being built, and they needed more workers. Not only did they need more workers, but they needed more coal. So people start to move from their jobs as farmers in the countryside, in the rural areas, and they start to move to the cities. That's something called urban migration. And the towns and cities get a lot bigger over this time. There are going to be some consequences for that, and we'll look at that in a second. The first thing we're going to look at is the thing that was powering this movement, and that was coal. Okay? When coal was burnt, it released steam which powered the factories. The coal was found in the ground and meant that more and more people were required to extract it. In 1821, the first large steam engine travelled from Stockton to Darlington, thanks to George Stephenson. This was the first use of what we know today as the powered train. So, coal, when it's burnt, releases steam. It's extracted from the ground, so you need miners to go down and get the coal out. The coal is burnt, the steam is released, and that powers all those machines that are moving in the factories. It also powers the train. So, Britain started using the trains massively, and one of the main uses of the train was to be able to transport goods. Okay, you no longer had to carry them by yourself or on horse, and it made it a lot easier to travel lots and lots of goods across the country. It also helped Britain build its empire. By using steam, goods were produced which made Britain wealthy and were able to afford a good army and navy to colonise other places. Britain soon had India, Australia, Canada as part of its empire. In 1851, Queen Victoria created a great exhibition to show all the goods she had got from the British Empire. Despite Britain becoming a powerful and wealthy country, during the 18th and 19th century, there were some negatives of the Industrial Revolution. So, not only did coal make the train and make these factories and allow people to move into the city for the jobs, it also made Britain a very powerful country. It meant that Britain could have a very strong navy. And then the British could use this navy to take over other places. When Britain then had those other places, it meant it could use the resources from the land there to help it become more wealthy. Okay? And the Great Exhibition is basically like a museum exhibit that Queen Victoria builds to show off almost how brilliant Britain is. Okay? So let's look at the negatives of the Industrial Revolution. Towns became very overcrowded, which meant the conditions were filthy. The conditions in factories were terrible, and people were often injured, and many died from working in factories or coal mines. The lives of people in the country that Britain had colonised also had some negatives. Some did not want Britain as part to be in control, and they thought they were taking over their country, and they reacted with violence. Okay? So, there were some negatives to this time period. One of them was the overcrowding of the cities, and this meant that a lot of people were living in slum conditions where houses were back to back from each other. This also meant that there was a lot of waste in the streets, lots of people living under one room, which spread diseases quicker, and lots of dirty water. Okay, we then also have the people in these countries that are owned by Britain, and they're not really happy with what's going on, and they react with violence and want to be independent. So, what we're going to move on to now is using this overview in the next few tasks. Now, the first thing we're going to use this overview for is to... Now we've looked at the source, we're going to move on to an imagined question. So you might need to read the overview again just to make sure you really understand what's going on. Imagine it's 1815 and you've just moved from the countryside to London to work in a factory. Write a letter to your parents back home. You might want to include what your home is like, what your job is like, and the conditions in the factory you work in, and what London is like. Okay? So you are going to write a letter, and you could start it by saying what you've done that day maybe. What have you done at work? What have you come home to? Describe the things around you. What can you smell? What can you see? What can you hear? Okay? You're going to describe some maybe the good things that have happened to you because of your move, and maybe the things that haven't been so good. Okay, the next task you need to do is you need to imagine you could go into a time machine and travel back to the Industrial Revolution. You only have 3 questions, but what 3 questions would you ask to someone in this period? Okay, make sure it's really precise because you don't want a general question that they don't answer properly. Okay, think about the types of people you could ask. You might want to ask someone that's living in a town or in the rural area. You might want to ask someone that's living in the empire. Think about the sort of things you want to know about. Do you want to know about their life, their culture, their diet, their work? And then write them down really carefully. So, the last task of the lesson is to go find out more. The first task you might want to do is to research what life was like in India under the rule of the British. Once you've done your research and Googled what's happened to India by the British, you might want to make a table. On one side, you might want to have the positive changes. So what were the good things that Britain brought to India? What helped the people in India? On the other side, you might want to have the negative impacts of the British being in India. Did they always treat the Indians nicely? Were there any bad things that they did to India? You then might want to watch a film like The Jungle Book or the latest Tarzan, which shows the European colonisation in parts of Asia and Africa. Why are the colonisers there? What do they want? Are they being greedy for anything? How are they treating the country that they are in, or the continent they are on? The last thing you might want to do is to complete the virtual tour of the Victorian Albert Museum. There is a link here for you to click on, which will take you right there. The Victorian Albert Museum is in London, and it shows things from the Empire. Can you find anything from there? What is it? What country is it from? Hello Year 7, today's lesson is what was America like in the 18th and 19th century, and this is something you will study next year. So we're just going to have a basic overview of what it was like so we can understand some stuff ready for next year. So today's question is focusing on what was America like as a place in the 17 and 1800s, alright? So we're going to look at the physical makeup of America, so what the land was like, the people that lived there, and the opportunities available to them and how they lived their lives, okay? So, discovered in 1492 by Christopher Columbus, North America is a very large area of land on the other side of the Atlantic. Britain made it part of its empire, and the 13 states on the east coast were the start of the Americas. Much of the land in the west had not been discovered yet by the European settlers. America became known as a land of opportunity, and many Europeans moved there to see if they could have success. So we're just going to go over this a little bit and make sure we understand what we have just read. So, America had never been discovered before, but because of changes in the technology and the ability to send boats further and not get lost, America was then discovered in 1492. And it was a really, really big continent. And they actually only really started to settle the east because of this, all right? So when Christopher Columbus first set foot on America, then lots of Europeans went over there afterwards, hearing about the new opportunities they could have there. So as they settled there, they obviously went to the bit that was easiest to get to, and that was the part on the east. Britain made it part of its empire, so that meant Britain ruled over it, and this was beneficial to Britain because they could get some of the resources from America, and also they sort of saw it as their duty to help this new country find its path. All right, but we're going to find out whether the Americans actually liked this. So, over time, these people had families, settled the lands, and called themselves Americans. Between 1775 and 1783, the people that lived in the East no longer wanted Britain to rule over them, and fought the War of Independence. So what happened was, these European settlers that came over in waves from 1492, they then had children, and their children had children, and over time these became known as the Americans, right? And they started to get a little bit fed up of the British rule. And then that turns up into being really fed up with the British rule, and they don't want Britain to be in charge of them anymore. So they have a big war of independence, and they are successful. And this means America became its own country. It didn't have another country ruling over them. They now made their own laws, they had their own systems of government, and they were in charge of themselves. And this is what the Americans really wanted, all right? Now we're going to find out what happens to America now it's a country of its own. So, Americans then moved west to find more farmland or see if the rumours of gold were true. Often they would find Native Americans as they crossed their land. These were the indigenous people of America and lived very differently to the white settlers and their descendants. So, indigenous people are basically the people that have been born onto that land, and they are the original population of that place. So although America was discovered in 1492, there were actually people living there for a lot longer before that. And these are the Native Americans. You might have heard of them as Indians before, okay? And we're going to find out how the relationship between these new Americans and these Native Americans formed over time, all right? So, there was often conflict between these two groups. The Native Americans lived in tribal communities and were very spiritual. They believed that the land did not belong to anyone and it should be respected. They followed the buffalo herds across America and used all parts of the buffalo for food, pots and pans, weapons and clothing. With the white Americans trespassing on their land, it often led to lots of conflict. So this relationship between the two groups doesn't sound very good. What happened was these Americans that lived on the East Coast were starting to become a larger population, and they wanted to spread westwards because they knew there was more land there. Also, they heard rumours that there was gold found all the way over in California, which is on the other coast of America, and they thought they'd be able to go there and make lots of money. So they tried to move there to take the resources from the soil. Now, as they passed across all of America's land, they actually came into contact with these people. Now, these people hadn't seen these white Americans before, and thought they were trespassing on their land, and saw them trying to dig up some of their land to find some of this gold, and they were really unhappy about it. Okay, so they start to basically have lots of arguments, lots of disagreements, and lots of conflict, where they're fighting over control of the land, and who is maybe in charge of those places. Now, the Native Americans see it as no one owns the land, and that the land is sacred and it must be respected. But the white Americans see it as it's their land to take, and they're going to take the things that are in that land. All right. So we're going to now move on to find out if it's just this group of people that these white Americans have conflict with. So it was not only Native Americans and white Americans that had conflict during the 19th century. In the south of the country, many farmers relied on slave labour to grow cash crops to transport and sell to European countries. So slave labour is when someone is enslaved against their will. They are not paid for their work, and they are made to work very hard, and they grow cash crops. So these are crops that make lots of money, and are relatively cheap to produce. So things like cotton and tobacco and sugar, because you grow the crop and then it's turned into something else which makes more money. So for example, if you grow lots of cotton, you would then take your cotton to a special mill, and it would be made into shirts, and these shirts can be sold for quite a lot of money. So the South use all this slave labour to basically grow all this and make lots of money from Europe. But as the 1800s continued, many people called abolitionists started to question slavery and wanted to see it stopped. In 1861 to 1865, there was a war dividing America. Okay, so abolitionists are people that believe in getting rid of slavery. Now, there are lots of reasons that people did not like slavery in this time. Some of it were moral reasons and religious reasons. They thought it wasn't right to have these enslaved people. Some reasons were economic, and they said actually if you paid your workers, they would work harder. And what it does is it causes basically a big line splitting America in half. You've got the people in the northern states that are these abolitionists, they want to get rid of slavery, and the people in the southern states that actually make a lot of money off it and they want to protect it. Now, these two sides end up going to war, okay, because they can't come up with any other agreements beforehand, and war is sort of the last resort for this conflict. So the war divides America, and eventually the North win. And Abraham Lincoln, who you might have heard of, he abolishes slavery. So that means he got rid of slavery, and he made a law in America's Constitution to say it couldn't happen anymore. So America during the 18th and 19th century, through this little overview, we can see as it's a period of conflict and people trying to maybe take over land or control workers. And basically lots of people are just trying to make lots of money in America, and this came with lots of conflict. So the next thing I would like you to do is, now we've read this overview, I would like you to look at this drawing by Paul Crane, and I would like you to write down in the space next to the drawing what it informs and suggests about the Native Americans. So this is a source, because remember, a source is something that's made at the time, a piece of information that's made at the time. And this is made in 1845, all right? So what does this source inform you about the life of Native Americans? Basically, what's it telling you? What can you see in that source? What things can you pick out to tell you how, to tell you what their life's like? You can then link this to what is it suggesting. So that's sort of where you read between the lines and you make some inferences, some educated guesses about what might be happening. So for example, you could pick out what the Native Americans are living in, and then you could link that to why might they be living in these places. All right. Once you've analysed your source, I would then like you to do an imagine task. You will need to use the overview for this, so you might want to read it again to help you. All right. Now, imagining you are one of these white Americans are moving westward. Okay, you have maybe found out there's gold in the west and you want to go over there. All right. And I would like you to write a letter back to someone that's on the East Coast. all right? And you need to say what your reasons for going, what your journey is like, and who you've encountered on your journey. So you're going to be telling that person how you've travelled from east to west, whether your journey was easy or difficult, what it was like in different places. So were there lots of different landscapes that you were in? Were you near rivers? Were you near mountains? What are the difficulties of those places? Why did you make this journey in the first place? America's really big and it would take you a very long time to go there. Is there a reason you wanted to go? Then once you've done that, I'd like you to think of some questions that you would have for people this time period. So imagine someone made a time machine and you were put in it and you could go back and you could ask them any 3 questions. What would it be? Now you might want to do a different question for different people at the time. So you might want to do one question for the Native Americans or one question for the enslaved people. All right, it's up to you, but you can do any 3 questions about their life, their jobs, who they are, and what the country is like as a whole. Well done for completing all your tasks. Now, if you would like to go and find out more, there are a few things that you can do to give yourself even more knowledge on this topic. So you could research slavery in America. What is the life like of these enslaved people? How might their life have been different after this civil war between the North and the South? What's changed for them? You could watch Pocahontas, which is a Disney movie, or another film that you find about Native Americans. What is their life like? What are their clothes and home like? What rituals do they have? Okay, so Pocahontas is a really good one for this, as you can see lots of things from it. You might have watched it before, but there will be some other ones available. And basically, I'd like you to just watch it and tell me what you can see and what this links to about their life. So what are they eating? What are they doing? Thank you very much, and well done for today's work.